At Sipadan, the night should have ended with waves outside the cabins. Instead, armed men came from the water. Guests and workers were forced onto boats before anyone could call for help. By sunrise, 21 people had vanished. And no one knew where the sea had taken them. April 23, 2000 started like any other day on Sipadan. Divers had spent hours in the water, workers were closing down the resort for the night, and the island had that tired quiet that comes after tourists go back to their rooms. Nothing looked urgent. That is probably what made the attack so hard to understand in the first seconds. The men came from the sea after dark. Not loud enough at first to warn the whole island, but fast enough that by the time people realized something was wrong, the armed men were already inside the resort area. Some guests were still awake. Others were pulled from rooms before they even understood who was shouting at them. A worker who had been doing a normal night shift was suddenly standing beside foreign tourists with guns pointed at all of them. No one had a full picture. One person saw weapons, another heard orders, someone else saw people being pushed toward the beach, and all of those small pieces turned into one clear fact. This was not a robbery. The attackers were not looking for watches, wallets, or cameras. They wanted people. Guests and staff were forced together, and in that moment it did not matter who was a tourist, who was Malaysian, who was Filipino, who had paid to be there, or who had come only to work. Everybody became useful to the men with guns. That is the ugly part of this case. Most of the hostages were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because they were there, on an island close enough to reach by boat and far enough away that help would not arrive in time. The attackers moved quickly. Every minute on Sipadan made the plan more dangerous for them, so they pushed the hostages toward the shore before calls could spread, before patrols could react, before anyone outside the island really knew what was happening. Then the boats were loaded. People were crowded together in the dark, frightened, confused, and still trying to make sense of a night that had changed too fast. Behind them, the resort lights stayed on. Tables, dive gear, cabins, and beach paths were left almost untouched, like the place itself was normal and only the people had been removed from it. That image is hard to shake. A quiet resort still standing there. And 21 people being taken across black water. At that point, they did not know the name of the group holding them. They did not know they were being taken toward the southern Philippines. Nobody told them how long this would last. The only thing they could hear clearly was the sound of the engines moving them farther from Sipadan. The ride away from Sipadan was the first moment when the hostages understood this was bigger than the resort. At the beach, everything had happened too fast. People had been shouted at, pushed together, forced toward the boats, and nobody had time to think clearly. But once the engines kept running, once the island lights disappeared behind them, the fear changed. It was no longer only about the men with guns. It was about distance. Some hostages tried to stay calm by watching the water. Others looked at the men around them and tried to guess what kind of mistake would make things worse. A few probably still hoped this would end quickly, maybe on another beach, maybe after a warning, maybe after money changed hands. But the boats did not turn back. Hour after hour, they moved through the dark, away from Malaysia and toward the southern Philippines. Nobody had a phone. Nobody had a map. The people sitting there did not know if help had already been called, or if the resort staff left behind were still trying to understand who was missing. When land finally appeared, it was not a rescue point. It was Jolo. That was where the kidnapping became something else. The men holding them were connected to Abu Sayyaf, a militant group known for ransom kidnappings in the region. To the hostages, the name may not have explained much in that moment. What mattered was easier to understand. They were surrounded, watched, and no longer anywhere close to the island where their day had started. A tourist who had come for diving was now walking through jungle. A worker who had expected to finish a shift was now being ordered forward by armed men. Everything normal had been left behind so quickly that the mind probably could not keep up with it. The first days were messy, tense, and exhausting. The hostages were moved from one place to another, not always because there was a clear plan, but because the kidnappers were trying to stay ahead of soldiers, patrols, and anyone who might be searching for them. If the guards got nervous, the group moved. When the terrain was rough, people still had to keep going. Captivity did not start with one dramatic speech. It started with thirst, bad sleep, sore legs, insects, and the pressure of not knowing which order mattered most. Stay quiet. Walk faster. Sit down. Get up. Keep moving. That kind of fear wears people down. Not all at once. It works slowly, through small things. A missed meal. A guard shouting too close. A rumor that release might happen, followed by another night in the jungle. For the people taken from Sipadan, the first days on Jolo made one thing clear. They had not just been kidnapped from an island. They had been carried into a crisis that could last much longer than anyone wanted to believe. By the time anyone outside the island understood the size of the attack, the people from Sipadan were already far away. Back at the resort, the scene must have looked unreal because almost nothing around them was destroyed. The cabins were still there. The dive gear was still on the island. Tables, pads, lights, bags, sandals, all the small things people leave behind when they expect to return in a few minutes. Only the people were missing. That is what made the first hours so hard to process. This was not a place after a battle. It was a resort with empty rooms and frightened witnesses trying to explain something that had happened too fast. Someone had seen armed men. Someone heard engines. Someone knew a guest had not come back. Another person realized a worker who had been on duty was gone too. Bit by bit, the truth became harder to deny. 21 people had been taken. Then the calls began. Families in different countries started hearing pieces of the same nightmare. A son who went diving was missing. A wife who should have been safe at a resort was gone. A worker who had simply shown up for his shift had been taken across the water by armed men. Nobody had enough answers. That is the part that would break people on the outside. You are told someone you love has been kidnapped, but you are not told where they are, what condition they are in, or who exactly is holding them. You wait beside a phone, and every new update can either keep you standing or knock you down. On Jolo, the hostages were living inside the same uncertainty from the other side. They had no way to know what had reached the news. Maybe their families knew. Maybe officials were negotiating. Maybe soldiers were searching close by, or maybe everybody was still guessing in the wrong direction. The captors could use that confusion whenever they wanted. A comment from one guard could make people think release was close. A change in tone could make the whole group go quiet. If the men argued among themselves, the hostages had to read the room without really understanding the language, the plan, or the danger behind it. Hope became risky. Too much hope could crush you when nothing happened. Too little could leave you empty before the ordeal was even close to over. So they learned to keep going in smaller ways. Save energy. Pay attention. Help the person beside you when the walk got harder. Do not react too strongly to promises. Do not fall apart when another night comes and you are still there. Outside the jungle, Sipadan was becoming an international hostage crisis. Inside the jungle, it was much simpler and much worse. 21 people were waiting for strangers to make the right decision before time, fear, or the men holding them made it for them. The first releases did not come like a clean ending. There was no single rescue, no one moment where soldiers arrived and everyone walked out together. The Sipadan case moved in a slower, uglier way, through talks, delays, middlemen, pressure, and deals that the hostages could only hear about in pieces. For the people inside the camp, that may have been the cruelest part. Someone would be told they might leave soon. Another person would hear a different name. A guard might look relaxed in the morning, then angry by afternoon, and suddenly nobody knew if the talks had failed or if the captors were only trying to scare them. When the first hostages were released, it was not only relief. It also changed the group left behind. A person who had shared the same fear with you for weeks was suddenly gone. That was good. Of course it was good. But if you were still sitting there after they left, the jungle could feel even heavier than before. Their nightmare had opened a door. Yours had not. Families outside lived through the same split. One family received the call they had been praying for. Another watched the news and had to keep waiting. Every release proved survival was possible, but it also proved that freedom would not come equally or quickly. The negotiations around Sipadan became larger than the island itself. Libya became involved in mediation. Officials spoke carefully. Reporters followed every rumor. Governments had to balance two things at once: bring people home alive, but avoid feeding the kind of kidnapping business that could make the next attack more likely. That is easy to talk about from a safe room. It is different when real people are sitting in a jungle, getting weaker, listening to guards, and wondering if some decision far away will decide whether they live or die. As the months dragged on, more captives were freed. Some left the jungle with thin faces, tired bodies, and stories they could not fully explain in one interview. They had survived the sea crossing, the marches, the uncertainty, and the strange routine of being valuable only because someone else could use them. But the crisis did not end cleanly. The attention around the Sipadan hostages pulled more people toward the danger. Journalists and mediators entered the area, trying to cover the story or help solve it, and some of them were taken too. What began with one night at a resort had become a wider hostage crisis that kept producing new fear. For the original captives, release meant walking out alive. For everyone else watching, Sipadan had already shown something hard to ignore. Once kidnapping becomes a business, even the people trying to understand it can become part of the price. When the Sipadan hostages finally came out, the story did not end the way people imagine. There was relief, yes. Families saw faces they had been afraid they might never see again. Survivors were checked by doctors, questioned by officials, and pushed back into a world that had kept moving while they were trapped in the jungle. But coming home alive is not the same as coming home untouched. A few weeks earlier, some of them had been planning dives, flights, meals, and quiet days near the water. Then they were sitting under guard, waiting for men with guns to decide if they would walk, sleep, eat, or move again. After release, people wanted answers. What happened? How did you survive? What did they say to you? How bad was it? Those are normal questions from the outside. For someone who lived through it, the answers are not always clean. You remember strange things. The sound of an engine. A guard's voice. The heat. The way people stopped talking when the mood in the camp changed. The first moment you understood that a promise of freedom did not mean freedom was coming. The world slowly moved on from Sipadan. That is what happens. A hostage crisis fills newspapers, then another story takes its place. The island becomes a name people remember from an old case. The survivors are expected to return to ordinary life, even though ordinary life has changed shape for them. The men connected to the kidnapping did not all disappear at once. Some were captured. Some were killed in later operations. Galibanang, known as Commander Robot, became one of the main names tied to the case, and he was killed during a prison uprising in 2005. The court ending came much later. In 2024, more than 2 decades after the attack, a Philippine court convicted 17 militants connected to the Sipadan kidnapping and sentenced them to life in prison. For the survivors, that sentence could not undo the night the boats came in. It could not give back the months they lost. Still, it put the crime back on record in a way that mattered. 21 people had been taken from a resort. They were not a headline, not a number, and not some old story from a dangerous region. They were guests and workers who had been pulled out of normal life because armed men saw value in holding them. Sipadan was supposed to be an escape. Clear water, small cabins, tourists, staff, and a quiet island far from everything. Then, one night, the sea brought men who turned that quiet into fear. And for the people taken from that shore, the sound of those engines was probably never just a sound again,